Amen. All right, and so this week, let's just look at 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 25. And it says there, after Paul talks about God and how he's put together the body and how he has, assigned various gifts to various people according to his own pleasure and will, he says, so that there would be no divisions in the body, but that the members would have the same care for each other. And so if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. And so that's the one another that we're going to be looking at. And you'll recall that there's kind of two of these that I think provide the base for all the other one another passages. And the first idea is just we love one another. And so all these passages are kind of an explanation of what that looks like. I think that we sometimes struggle, okay, I understand I'm supposed to love my brother, but how do I go about, actually doing that? And I think these passages, these one another passages, help us picture that. But the other basis that we've looked at in the past and that kind of helps us see why these are so important is here in 1 Corinthians 12 when he says that we're members of one another. And it's in this context that Paul says that we're to care for one another. And so I think the idea here is that we're, number one, to show the same care for one another. Notice he says that. And I think the idea there is that we're not showing partiality. We're not favoring one member of the body over the other. But the other emphasis there is that I'm supposed to care for somebody other than myself. And that's really the idea that Paul is getting across here. And I think that's a powerful idea in kind of a self-obsessed world. And so when I was thinking about, okay, how can I explain that the world is, what's a good illustration for self-obsession? Maybe what's one of the first things that comes to your minds when you think of self-obsession? Selfies, right? And so I was, it's kind of low-hanging fruit, but, that's kind of this physical manifestation, right? We can talk about a lot of anecdotes, but it seems like selfies are just a good physical manifestation of how obsessed we are with ourselves. And so this was kind of funny to me that all I did was type in selfie statistics, and the first thing that pops up is injuries related to selfies, or deaths related to selfies. I didn't even know this was a thing before I started looking at it, but apparently there's people that are so obsessed with getting just the right picture that they become oblivious to the surroundings that are around them, and they have found themselves doing kind of silly or foolish things, and it's resulted in people dying. And so it's kind of something that's not a laughing matter, obviously, because people have lost their lives, but it's just kind of shocking, and you got to appreciate that photo, a person taking a selfie in front of an oncoming train. But this is a real statistic. More people die taking selfies than in shark attacks. I think this week's Shark Week, so there's that shark statistic for you. But I think 8 people a year die from shark attacks, and I think it's something like 30 to 40 people every year die from selfie-related incidents. That's insane. And when you read the types of stories, there's all sorts of different stories. There's 11 people taking a photo of themselves in front of a big tower during a huge thunderstorm, and the tower got struck and the tower fell on top of them. There's instances where they're taking a photo of themselves, and there's a cliff behind them, and they're stepping back and they step off the cliff. There was one instance that I read about where there was these 3 guys who didn't know how to swim, and they ran to the back of the boat. All 3 of them ran to the back of the boat to take a selfie together. They all 3 fell off the boat, and they all died because the boat wasn't driving itself. You just have weird example after weird example. The weirdest one was they were taking what's called a shoe selfie, which I never heard of a thing. But apparently 5 people paid a helicopter pilot to go up into the air, and there's this coveted photo, shoe selfie, where you take a picture of your shoes, your feet, hanging out of a helicopter, over New York City is the photo they're trying to get. And they were wearing this harness, and one of the people got up out of his seat and basically turned off like the emergency fuel shut off because the harness caught the lever. Turned it off, and the helicopter crashed, and all 5 of those people died, all to get a selfie. And so you realize just what lengths, what dangerous situations people put themselves in, and how oblivious people come to the things that surround them, even oblivious to the danger that they're putting themselves in, but also the danger that they're putting other people in as well. I think that it just is kind of a good metaphor for what we see all the time. But this is how many selfies people take. It said on average, they interviewed 1,000 millennials. This was millennials that they interviewed, so people that were at the time 18 to 25. And so on average, a millennial would take 9 selfies a week. That's probably gone up by now in 2022. And they estimated, according to these people's answers, that it took about 7 minutes to take each selfie. So that's not just taking the picture, but that's taking the right picture, and then you go back and you edit it, and you get the right lighting, and you look just the way that you want so that people see you the way that they want to see you. And so that averages out to be 3,276 minutes a year the average millennial spends taking selfies, according to this survey. And so that's actually 54 hours a year. So that's over 2 days every single year that somebody is spending out of their life taking a selfie. And I think the number came out to be that a millennial in their lifetime will take 25,000 selfies or something like that. Now, if you take a selfie, and we all have taken a selfie, that doesn't mean that you're self-obsessed. Ray says that, no, you haven't taken a selfie. All right, we'll have to change that. We'll get him to take a selfie one of these days. Yeah, there you go. It doesn't count. He's got to take it himself. It doesn't mean that you're self-absorbed if you take a selfie. I think we've all done that. But I think we've also seen, out in the social media world, how you have whole social media profiles that are just one picture of themselves after another, after another, after another. But when you read what Paul says, we're not to be obsessed with ourselves. What Paul says is that we are to have the same, we're to be concerned and care for each other to the extent that if one person suffers, then we suffer with them. If one person succeeds, then we rejoice with them. In the world, it's every man for himself. It's as long as my life is going well, I don't have to be too concerned about other people's lives so long as I'm not close to them, kind of a thing. And so when somebody else does well, then that's a reason to be jealous of somebody else because they've achieved something that I myself didn't achieve. But Paul tells us to be concerned to care for each other, which is a really strong word. It means literally to worry, to be anxious about something. In fact, when this word is translated, a majority of the time it's translated as anxious. I think in my Bible, the Greek word is used 19 times, 17 times it's translated as anxious. Means to be concerned about. It's the same word that Jesus uses in Matthew 6 and the Sermon on the Mount where he says, don't worry. Don't worry about your life, what you'll eat, what you'll put on. It's the same word that Paul uses in Philippians 4:6 where he says, don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And so in one passage in Philippians, Paul writes to somebody and says, don't worry about anything. But then in his letter to the Corinthians, he's going to use the same word, and he's going to say, worry, be concerned for each other. And so how do we reconcile that? On one hand, Paul says, don't worry about anything. On the other hand, Paul says, be concerned for each other. What's going on there? So a lot of times we see this idea of not worrying, and it has a lot to do often with material worries. Again, that's what Jesus is really addressing, your life, what you'll wear, what you'll eat. And he says, you know what? God knows you have need for all these things. And I think it's also addressing excessive worry to the point where it disrupts your life. But I think if we're going to worry about anything, if we're going to lose sleep at night over anything, don't you think worrying about souls is probably the only thing that really matters in the end? I mean, if we're going to worry about something, it better be that. And yet what we often see is a selfie-type culture in the church, where the church isn't a community where I'm to pitch in and provide and to support my brothers, but it's something that is there solely for me. And so we view church through the lens of what we are getting or what we aren't getting out of it. And that's the lens we solely view it through often. And so what does this look like? When we talk about caring for others, a lot of us would acknowledge we need to do that, but the problem is we are willing to care for others to the extent that I benefit from it. Which sounds kind of weird, but are we capable of benefiting and having that be our motivation to caring for people? What are some potential benefits? What's in it for us when we care for people sometimes? Prestige, okay. Yeah, how others look at you. Jesus kind of talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't he? What does Jesus talk about there in Matthew 6? Be careful when you're doing what? That's right. And the first thing that he mentions, first example he gives is what? Giving alms. So that's good, right? Giving to the poor, addressing their needs in their financial situation, and you give money to them or you provide food for them. That's a good thing, but what Jesus says is don't do it with the motivation of being seen by others. And sometimes that's what we get out of it, is we care for people and people see how caring we are and we like that, and that goes to our head, and that's really in the end why we are actually doing it. And the problem is when you care for people only to the extent that you get something out of it, you're only going to care for people so much. And actually, you don't really care for them at all. You care more about yourself than you do the person. And I think that's what Jesus is addressing in Matthew 6. Some of us say, I'm just here for me, right? I show up on Sunday and Wednesday. I get my church in. I get my service in. I hear the songs. It builds me up. I'm in, I'm out, and I'm home. And I don't want to be involved any more than that. I don't want to be involved any more than what I have to be. That's not consistent with what we see Paul saying when he says we have to care for each other. How about we don't do things because we say we don't enjoy them? Have you ever heard somebody say, I don't go to funerals, I just don't like them? You ever heard somebody say something like that? And who really does like funerals? Or have you heard somebody say, I don't go to hospitals, I don't like hospitals? Again, who likes hospitals? It's full of people who are sick, suffering. Go ahead, David. Yeah, and you think about it from their point of view, right? If I'm in that position one day and somebody I love isn't going to come see me because they don't want to see me in that position, maybe it's a grandkid or something like that, am I going to be thinking, oh good, they're not going to see me that way? You know what I mean? I don't think so. I think that we all want to be surrounded by as many people who love us as possible. And so I've heard that same thing as well. Visiting nursing homes. Nursing homes are very depressing places, and Frank will be the first one to tell you, right? Frank, nursing homes are not a fun place to be. I think you call them prison, right? Nursing homes? I remember you called your nursing home a prison, right? Oh. Well, of course not, yeah. Yeah. Well, you talked to Frank, and when he was in a retirement home. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yep, well said. But yep. But when Frank tells you he did a stint in prison, he didn't actually go to prison, okay? Because I made that, when he first told me that, I thought he actually went to prison. But he was actually saying that he was in a nursing home. And, newsflash, if we don't enjoy nursing homes, how much do the people who are in them enjoy being in them? It's not a fun place to be, but there's people there that, and maybe not of our numbers currently, or maybe there's a couple. And if there are, we have to go and visit them and encourage them. That's, we're all going to be there one day. sometimes we focus on the church's failures to care for me. We think about all the ways that maybe I'm depressed and I'm discouraged and things that I would like to see more people do for me, but that's just another example of kind of a selfie culture that exists in my life or in the church. And so we see the opposite in Scripture of the greatest men that we read about in the Bible. I love this verse in Philippians 2, verses 19 through 21. By the way, where is Paul when he writes Philippians? He's in prison. And so here he is, he's writing a letter to the Philippians, and it's a very encouraging letter. And here's a man who could have just, wallowed in prison, wallowed in his circumstance, wallowed in how rough things are in his life. But here he is writing a letter for Christians to benefit from. But he says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon so that I too may be encouraged by news about you. For I have no one else like-minded who will genuinely care about your interests. All seek their own interests, not those of Christ. That word that Paul uses, that's translated in my Bible as genuinely care, is the same word Paul uses, same word Jesus uses, this idea of worrying, caring for. But I like how this is translated. The key word is to genuinely care for others. It's very easy to kind of feign that, right? To show my care for others in a way that kind of checks the box, right? Okay, that person, they get the impression that I care for them, I can move on to the next person. And I'll never forget something that someone said to me. This was a member of the church, and she was talking about how sometimes preachers, especially in large congregations, they'll come up and they'll talk and they'll ask questions. And I think David could relate to this too, as I could relate to it. But they'll ask questions, but they're already they're looking through the person they're asking, because in their mind, they're thinking, okay, I got to go do this, I got to go talk to this other person, I got to make sure I say hi to them before they leave the building. And so in our efforts sometimes to show care to a lot of people, we actually show no care at all. Because we're asking questions, we're checking the box, but the person can tell that we're not really there. We're just doing what we're supposed to be doing. But Paul says that Timothy genuinely cares for their interests. What do you think that looked like for Timothy to go there? Obviously this is more than just greeting somebody in the auditorium at the church in Philippi. What does this mean when Paul says, look, Timothy, he genuinely cares about you? What's taking place there? What's Paul talking about? Perhaps. Love? Yep. Yeah, so he's going to have this, attitude that he's willing to do anything for those Philippians. Yeah? What else? Okay. What do you mean? Right. And so how do you think that compared to these other people that Paul is referring to, kind of vaguely? So Paul says that Timothy genuinely cares about your interests. All seek their own interests. All the others, they seek their own interests. What's the difference between Timothy and these other people that Paul's referring to? Obviously. Yeah. Yep. And you're not going to have unity if you have leaders that are just seeking their own interests, that's for sure. That's obviously the difference, right? That Timothy's there because he has this genuine care for the saints there. In other words, he wants to see them go to heaven. And that's really the only thing he cares about. He doesn't care about how much money they can give him. He doesn't care about how much praise they can give him. He doesn't care about the ways that he could physically benefit through a relationship and through being influential among these people. Paul knows he can trust Timothy because he knows Timothy will care about these people even the way that Paul himself cares about these people. And Paul kind of alludes to people preaching for selfish ambition. And you can think there's a lot of different reasons why somebody can preach, why somebody might have wanted to go and be influential among those Philippians. But Paul says he can't trust him. He can only trust Timothy because Timothy genuinely cares about these individuals. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, let me go back. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button, that's why. There we go, sorry.
It's interesting that in verse 19,
Mm-hmm.
he's saying to Timothy, so that I may be encouraged. Of course, the intention in verse 1 is what Timothy will do for him. But there's kind of a reverse process in play here that by focusing on them, their needs, their concerns, Paul says, I'll be encouraged. It's what Jesus said. It's more blessed to give than to receive. I think that's exactly Paul by reaching out to the Philippians and doing what he can to promote them to see their needs. Most encouraging.
Yeah, because he's going to receive news back, and hopefully it's good news. And what's that going to do for Paul while he's sitting in prison? You said it, it's going to be encouraged by that. So yeah, well said. When we take our attention off ourselves and pour our energy into other people, often that's the best path to to being happy and being encouraged. The more we focus on ourselves, the more we focus on what we don't have, what we wish we have, and all the things that we don't like. But Paul, he says, and there's some heartache that goes with this too, when caring for people. Paul's mentioning, he's kind of giving his resume as an apostle in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And he's just mentioning all these different things that he's endured, all the ways that he suffered for their sake and for the sake of the gospel, how he's been whipped and beaten, and on he goes if you've read that chapter. But then he kind of just mentions off to the side, he says, apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. So Paul's life was completely consumed with the well-being of others. And when we talk about somebody that we admire, the reason we admire this guy so much is because he wasn't nearly as concerned for himself as he was for other people. And I think that's what enabled him to be so influential, so impactful in all these churches, because he didn't care what happened to him so long as he was bringing as many people as possible to heaven with him. And you think about all the people that are most influential, all the people that we look up to most in the church, it's because they're the people that care the most for others. They're the ones that have a packed funeral when they pass away because of all these lives that they affected, including our own. And so that's the kind of guy that Paul was. He was. This was a daily pressure. It was this worry, this thing that I imagine kept him up at night. How is the church in Corinth doing? I sent this letter. How are they going to respond to it? This is what consumed his whole life. But it's a worthwhile endeavor. And so when we talked about being absorbed with ourselves and wanting people to care for us, there's something interesting that happens, that as we show care for others will show care for us, even though that's not the motivation why we're doing it. But the point is that sometimes, we're, maybe not happy with our church family. We wish that people would do more for us, but there's a good chance that there's other people that are thinking the very same thing. And so when we recognize that, really what's going on is we're recognizing maybe a problem, and the only person that can fix it is you. We can explain the problem to other people, try and bring it to other people's attention, but it's not going to do as much good as if I set out to try and solve the problem myself to some degree, because you've recognized the problem, and chances are you care about it more than the person you're explaining it to. And sometimes to impact change, all it takes is one person. And so I just find Dale Carnegie, his quotes are just amazing to me. If you've never read How to Win Friends and Influence People, everybody needs to read that book. Because I think that he has a lot of biblical principles in there. But he says you can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. Isn't that true? That we can sit around and wait for people to be interested in me, wait for people to care for me, but it's going to happen a lot faster if I say, you know what, I just need to take this first step and care for this other person. And I just thought about that. When it comes to the gospel, and spreading the gospel, don't we wish more people were interested in the gospel? And we sit around and we go to coffee shops and we're in stores and we say, I wish somebody would just come up and talk to me about my faith. Maybe we don't say that, but I think that's almost what we expect to happen sometime. But I don't think we can expect other people to be interested in the gospel until we first show them that we have an interest in them, that we care for them. That's really the first step, but I think that principle also applies to the church. He goes on and he says, talk to someone about themselves and they'll listen for hours. So do you ever feel like you're in competition with somebody when you're talking to them? And it seems like a lot of times we approach conversation and we're waiting for somebody to say something that I can relate to so I can begin talking about myself. And that's okay, we all do it. But there's a reason that we do that, and what's that reason? There's one thing we all love to talk about, and what is it? It's ourselves. We all love talking about ourselves, don't we? And so the principle here is, look, when we talk to people, if we want to make a connection, if we want to show people that we care for them, the best way to do that is not to talk about me, but start talking about them. And, Jack Hafer, who trained me, it's funny, he told me a while ago that he learned a long time ago when somebody comes into his office and maybe they're a little discouraged, maybe they're a little down, he says he doesn't hardly say a word. He'll hardly say anything to them. He'll just let them talk, and then they leave saying, wow, that was the best conversation. I just feel so uplifted and encouraged. And it's amazing how encouraging it is for people just to have us listen to them and to talk about them and to encourage them. But that takes genuinely caring for them, not looking through them, not waiting for the conversation to be over, but genuinely taking this interest in them. He says to be interesting, be interested. Right? And this isn't a casual interest. He's using the word interesting. But again, if we want people to care for us, I think the first step is I got to show that I care for them and genuinely care for them, not this I'm trying to get something out of it. I think the first early church practiced this well. In Acts 4, in verse 32, it says, the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own. But they had everything in common. And with great power, the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. So how many of us have seen a church like that? Or have been a part of a church like that? Now granted, you have. Okay, that's good. Granted, these are exceptional circumstances where the early church was facing poverty. I think you had people that were staying in Jerusalem because of the day of Pentecost and what happened there, and so they kind of just left their lives behind, and the church was growing like crazy. But look at the response to whatever the need was there in Jerusalem. What lengths were they willing to go to for each other? Yeah, everything. They give up their homes. They give up land. Maybe this was land that was passed down through generations. And they sell it so that they can address the needs of their brother. So what was it that enabled them to do that? And the question is, are we capable of that if it came to it? If inflation really got out of hand and we start losing our homes and struggling to buy food and struggling to provide for our families, is that going to be another opportunity for Satan to get the best of us, or is that going to be an opportunity for the gospel of Jesus to shine in his people? Because that could have gone one or two ways for the people in Jerusalem. It could have just, their poverty, whatever it was they're enduring, it could have been, you got your social elites in Christianity, and then you got the poor, right? And then the poor just kind of get fed up with it, and they're gone, and there's division. But back then, they said, our brothers have need. We're going to sell whatever we can, and nothing is my own. That what I have belongs to my brother in need. What I have belongs ultimately to God, and how can God use what I have? And I think that's the lens we have to view our possessions if we really care about each other. That's not to say that we go home tonight and we call our real estate agent. But how can I use these things that God has blessed me with whatever it is, whether it's a small house or a big house, an apartment, a car. How can I use the things that God has blessed me with to bless others? And I think that's, the lens that these first Christians viewed their possessions. That these belong to God, and they're to be used by God to help others. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that. I just think that's a very, very remarkable passage, and you get some insight into kind of how powerful the grace of God was in the first century there. They're one heart, one mind. Another example, James 1, verse 26. This verse has always stood out to me, right? He's talking about how we talk and says that if we're religious and we don't bridle our tongue, then we deceive our hearts. And he says our religion is worthless. Wow, so our words are really important. And then at the end of this verse, he talks about, keeping one unstained from the world. And those are, we talk about that all the time, right? I talked about it last week, purity. That's an important topic. Being holy, being pure, not being attached to this world's possessions, not being attached to what the world has to offer. But notice what he puts right in the middle of that. And it's just as important as controlling your words, just as important as keeping oneself unstained from the world. He says, visit orphans and widows in their affliction. He says, this is pure religion. This is pure and undefiled religion, to visit orphans and widows, to keep one unstained from the world. So what does it mean to visit orphans and widows? How does that even apply to us? Because I don't know where our local orphanage is. Do you? That's not really how things work anymore. Yeah, take care of their needs. Yeah, so in other words, does it mean that back then, did it mean you just go visit them, sit with them, talk to them? No. It means you take care of their needs. If they're hungry, feed them. If they're cold, clothe them. Whatever the needs were, they were to be addressed. Does this verse only apply to orphans and widows? Who else might it apply to? So basically, that's right. Yeah. People who are impoverished, people who are marginalized, people who didn't get the same start in life that we got. Because I think if a lot of us think about our lives that are here in this room, think about maybe the families we were raised in, think about the country we live in. You can go on and on talking about the things we have going for us. I think we can all acknowledge that we have a lot more going for us in our lives than maybe most people did. Especially if you're raised in the church, you got something going for you that so many people don't. And so this is what James says is pure and undefiled religion. And I think one of the best ways we care for each other is to bear one another's burdens. That's another one another passage there. But Paul says that if someone is overtaken in any wrongdoing or sin or trespass, however your Bible translates that, he says, you who are spiritual, restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so that you also won't be tempted. Carry one another's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. And so there's a lot of things, I feel like when we talk about this passage, we address what it doesn't mean, right? Because we'll talk about how Paul goes on to say, and everybody's got to carry his own load. And that's true. There's some problems that we got to bear ourselves, or at least we got to shoulder our load, but then there's other issues where Paul says we got to bear each other's burdens. So I don't want to focus on what this doesn't say. What does this say? What is Paul saying here? What does this mean when he says bear each other's burdens? What does it look like? It's hard, isn't it? I always think about somebody carrying a giant rock on their back, right? Huge boulder that, is unrealistic to expect anybody to handle that on their own. The only way they can lift it is if somebody else helps them. Paul, he specifically, in this context, really, what is he talking about when he tells us to carry each other's burdens? What's the word that he mentions? What's he addressing? And so a lot of times there can be people that come into these doors and, ooh, that person sins, they're too icky for me. I can't deal with that. I can't be around that. And there's an element to that where we got to be careful. He says that when you're restoring people, you got to be careful. Watch out for yourself so that you won't be tempted. We don't ever want to put ourselves in a spot where we're going to be tempted to sin. But we do have this responsibility to bear each other's burdens. And I just think it's interesting that Paul mentions this in the context of sin. And maybe sometimes the issue is that we're not open with each other enough about the sins that we're struggling with to give our brothers an opportunity to help carry that burden. But I don't think this principle just applies to sin. You know, what else might it apply to? I got a list of things, right? So how about marital difficulties, right? By the way, when we're bearing burdens, does that mean that we're solving the problem? No. It means you're helping. You're helping lift in whatever way you can, and maybe that just means sitting down with somebody. We harp on Job's friends quite a bit, and deservedly so, but they actually got it right at the beginning. They messed up after the fact. But what did Job's friends do when Job was first, going through all of that, and they found out about it? They sat in silence for 7 days. And sometimes that's what it takes, right? Sometimes that's all you can do. You don't talk to somebody, you don't try and solve their problems for them, but you sit with them. You listen to them if they talk. Spend time with them. And those of us who have been through difficulties, lost a loved one, you realize that there's nothing somebody can say to solve some problems. But sometimes it helps just to be in the same room, or to be in the same house, or to know that somebody's there if you reached out to them. I think sometimes that's all we need to be. It starts with that. But, you can think of all the problems that somebody might deal with and how we can help them. Financial woes. Parents that have struggling kids that are maybe rebellious. Young people in their struggles. We know that it's really hard nowadays growing up. Are we attentive to that? Are we looking to help in any way we can? People who are lonely, depressed, discouraged, jobless, people who are chronically ill, those struggling with addiction. Are these people that we're looking out for? Are we even aware of what each other's burdens are? Are we aware of what each other's struggles are? Do we even give ourselves a chance to be aware? And so this is really the question when it talks about caring for each other and bearing each other's burdens. The question is, what are really the steps to bearing somebody's burden? Okay, so backwards, the last step is bearing somebody's burden, right? But what does it take in order to get to that point? And so maybe let's back up for a second. Let's imagine somebody where there's somebody like this carrying a giant rock, or somebody's trying to load something up into their vehicle, and it's far too heavy for them to bear. What are literally just the most basic steps, the things that have to happen before you get to the point where your hands are actually on the load and you're throwing that thing into the back of the truck? What are all the things that have to happen before that takes place? Okay, you have to recognize they need help. Okay. Okay. Yep. That's definitely true. Like sometimes you're loading something into the truck and some random guy offers to help and you're like, I don't know you. But even somebody offering to help, that builds trust, doesn't it? It's kind of amazing how that works. But what else? So let's go through this. Last step is bearing the burden. Well, step before that is you got to know the burden. As you said, right? And you got to be observant in order for that to happen. You can't bear something that you don't know about, right? So you have to know about the burden. How do we get to know about the burden? Even that is sometimes a challenge, isn't it?
And that actually, really tell them to go to church, to always remember Jesus.
Yep.
And God. Mm-hmm. That's the main thing, is talk to people about them things.
Very true. Yeah, you got to take that first step. But before you can know about the burden, you got to know the person. Do people just come up to you and say, hey, here's all my burdens? Is that how people work? What does it take for you to open up to somebody about something that you're struggling with? What does it take for you to get to the point where you're finally willing to confess this sin to somebody? Or you're finally willing to tell them that you're having problems managing your money? Or you finally get to the point where you tell them that you're struggling with depression and you don't know what to do? What does it take for you to get to that point? It takes somebody that you know. It takes somebody you trust. But before you know the person, you got to speak to the person. You're never going to get to know somebody that you're not talking to. Before you speak to the person, you got to approach the person. So it's amazing. A church can become full of people that just know each other in passing, right? They see each other from the other side of the room. At some point, we have to be willing to approach each other. First, you got to see the person. Well, that means that I'm here on Sundays. I'm here on Wednesdays. And before you can see the person, you got to be around the person. Again, I'm here at the services when they're open. I'm putting myself in position where all these steps can naturally take place. You think about it, when it comes to bearing burdens, that's kind of a lofty idea. That's kind of challenging for us to think about how can we get to that point in somebody's life. And maybe this is oversimplifying it because it's not that simple. But we at least have to do this much, don't we? We at least have to talk to people. We at least have to take somebody out to coffee and sit down with them, sometimes one-on-one, and give them that chance to open up to us. And so maybe we are looking at this and having this conversation and are thinking, well, I don't know of anybody's burdens. I don't know of anybody dealing with any problems. I think maybe the first step is just to get to know somebody a little bit better. Or maybe we look at our relationship with other Christians, and maybe my only interactions that I'm having with other Christians are on Sundays and Wednesdays. That means the first step is to have just one more interaction outside of Sundays and Wednesdays. That's a reasonable thing to do, isn't it? That's a reasonable goal. I just need to work on having one more interaction or getting to know one more person than who I already know. Or I need to get to know somebody just a little bit better. I've kind of known them on the surface. I want to get to know them just a little bit better, where they're from, how they became a Christian. Having those types of conversations, if we don't ever do that, we're never going to get to the point where we feel comfortable bearing each other's burdens, because that's a job for family. And if we're not treating each other like family, it's just not going to happen. And so, you know this verse. I know I'm out of time. I have a couple verses or a couple quotes I want to share. This one kind of jarred me. This guy says, "I was hungry, and you formed a humanities club and discussed my hunger. I was in prison, and you crept off quietly to your chapel in the cellar and prayed for my release. I was naked, and in your mind you debated the morality of my appearance. I was sick, and you knelt and thanked God for your health. I was homeless, and you preached to me the spiritual shelter of the love of God. I was lonely, and you left me alone to pray for me. You seem so holy and so close to God, but I'm still very hungry and lonely and cold." I look at that, and I've done a couple of those, right? Somebody's got a cancer diagnosis. Oh, thank you, God, that's not me, right? No, why don't we take the steps to encourage those people and not just thank God that it's not us? Care for people the way that we would want to be cared for. I'll finish with this one, and then one verse by the Apostle Paul. This guy, Jerry Bridges, he talks about this idea of the body. And he says, can you imagine that you have the body, and you got the arms and the legs, and the ear is talking to the eye, and he says, can you imagine, or did you hear what was going on with the foot and how messed up the foot is? Oh man, he better get it figured out. He's kind of using this illustration. And he says, the foot surely ought to get his act together. So you got the ear and the eye talking. But he says, no, our bodies don't behave that way at all. Instead, the entire body cries out, my foot hurts, I feel awful. Why does the whole body hurt when only one part is injured? It is because all the parts of the body make up one invisible whole. And when one part hurts, no matter what the reason, the restorative powers of the entire body are brought to bear on the hurting member. Rather than attacking that suffering part or ignoring the problem, the rest of the body demonstrates concern for for the part that hurts. This is the way the body of Christ should function. And I think that's what Paul's getting at when he says, if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. So Paul says to care for one another. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts. I went 5 minutes over. Apologize for that. But any comments or thoughts or questions? No. All right. Well, thank you for your time.